It began with a whisper, then a flicker, a tremor, a sharp crack in the polished veneer of a story the world had been told and told again. The fairy tale was perfect. Too perfect. A Hollywood actress turned royal duchess, marrying her prince, birthing royal heirs, smiling in soft focus portraits as the world clung to the image of a new modern monarchy. But like all fairy tales, this one was built on something fragile. And when Trevor Engelson, her ex-husband, her past, her secret keeper, finally spoke, that fragile illusion shattered into 1,000 shards of truth. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. There was no press conference, no red carpet moment, just a private conversation that leaked online, a confidential legal document, and a voice the world had almost forgotten. The voice of the man Meghan Markle left behind before she became the Duchess of Sussex. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't dramatic. He was tired and ready to reveal the truth about what happened before Meghan met Harry, about her desperate struggle with infertility, about a surrogacy contract signed years before the world ever knew the name Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, and ready, most of all, to confirm what many had suspected but no one dared to say out loud, that Meghan Markle did not give birth to either of her children. The story, of course, doesn't begin with a revelation. It begins with a question, one the world kept asking in hushed tones but never had the courage to answer. Why did Meghan's pregnancy seem different? Why no public medical confirmations? Why the bizarre belly-shifting videos? Why the secrecy? Why the oddly timed photographs? Why the lack of hospital staff interviews, no formal announcements from medical teams, and no traceable OB/GYN attached to the royal birth? But people were too afraid to ask, too loyal, too enamored, too distracted. The palace machine did what it does best. Controlled the narrative, spun the questions into racism, into tabloid cruelty, into jealousy. Meghan was a victim, a modern-day Diana. She was protecting her children from a cruel press. That was the line. That was the shield. And for a time, it worked. Until now. Trevor Engelson wasn't supposed to talk. Not ever. When Meghan left him, the divorce was swift and brutally silent. No courtroom drama. No press war. No interviews. Just an envelope, a courier, and her engagement to Harry months later. He disappeared, as if scripted out of the next act of her life. But behind closed doors, Trevor had watched as the woman he once loved transformed herself into royalty. He stayed silent as she reshaped her identity, as she spoke of feminism, family, motherhood. He listened when she said, on Oprah, that she was so happy to have her little bundle and was excited to nurture and guide her children in this crazy world. He didn't blink when she wore maternity wear with pride. He didn't even speak when people began questioning her baby bump and the way it seemed to collapse inwards as she bent over. But everything changed after Lilibet. That second pregnancy had been even more suspicious than the first. This time there were virtually no public appearances. The photos were carefully curated, sometimes filtered so heavily the lines between skin and cloth blurred. There were no hospital records, no statements from doctors, no confirmed location of her delivery. Meghan and Harry announced the birth with a polished PR statement and a name that paid tribute to the late Queen and Harry's mother Diana. It should have been beautiful, a symbol of healing, a royal milestone. Instead, it triggered Trevor. In his private circle, Trevor had been quiet, but never unaware. He knew her. He knew the truth she buried. And more than that, he knew what they had signed. Years ago, long before Buckingham Palace, before Suits, before the world knew Meghan as a future duchess, there was a moment where desperation met ambition, where Meghan had realized that motherhood, for her, would not be as natural as she once believed, that her dream of having children might never come true, at least not the way most women imagined. Trevor had been there through it all. The medical visits, the fertility tests, the long nights with syringes and hormone kits, and whispers of failure. He had held her hand through more than one late-night conversation about options. IVF, egg donors, surrogacy, adoption. She had cried, and he had comforted her. But eventually, the cracks grew too deep. Meghan was changing, becoming harder, more focused. She wanted out of Hollywood. She wanted power. She wanted image. And motherhood, it became part of that image. They drafted the contract in Los Angeles. It was discreet, locked behind law firms with aggressive confidentiality clauses. Meghan didn't want anyone to know, not her parents, not her co-stars, not even the future she hoped to walk into. The surrogate's identity was kept strictly anonymous. The agreement laid out rights, restrictions, behavioral clauses, and termination scenarios. The language was clinical, cold, but Trevor remembered it all, because he helped write it. And he kept a copy. Years passed, and the contract lay buried in a safe. Meghan moved on. So did he. But the story didn't end. It simply went dormant. Until the news broke about a possible leak. A former legal assistant at one of the involved firms contacted an international tabloid and suggested she had seen documentation tying Meghan Markle to a surrogate agreement, dated years before Archie's birth. The editors didn't run it. Too risky. Too dangerous. But someone else got wind. Someone reached out to Trevor, and for the first time in years, he considered telling the truth. Why now? That's the question everyone would ask. Why not 5 years ago? Why not when Meghan married Prince Harry? Or when they left the royal family? Or during the Oprah interview? Because sometimes the truth takes time to surface. Because sometimes a man has to live with something before he realizes he can't live with it anymore. Because sometimes silence becomes its own prison. In an off-the-record conversation with a private investigator, one that was never supposed to be recorded, Trevor confirmed what had long been suspected. That Meghan Markle never carried Archie or Lilibet. That both children were born via surrogate. That the palace knew. That legal agreements were signed to protect the image of the monarchy and preserve public illusion. He didn't sound angry. He didn't even sound vindictive. He sounded relieved. Relieved that the burden was no longer his alone. But this story, this revelation, doesn't stop with one man's truth. It ripples. It cuts through the fairy tale like a knife. Because if Meghan never gave birth to her children, what does that mean for their royal titles? What does it mean for their citizenship? Their legacy? Their inheritance? What does it say about a monarchy built on bloodlines when a fundamental part of that lineage is fabricated for image? More importantly, what does it say about a woman who would go to such lengths to hide her truth? As we begin this journey, we will uncover the documents, the timelines, the testimony, the cover-ups, the media manipulation, and the emotional wreckage left in the wake of a secret long kept in shadow. We will explore not just the facts, but the feelings, the heartbreak of infertility, the shame, the ambition, the choices made behind closed doors. We will hear from those who knew her then, from experts in fertility law, from palace aides caught in the middle of a lie they couldn't control. This isn't a takedown. It's not gossip. It's not tabloid drivel. It's a reckoning. And by the time we're done, you'll never see Meghan Markle or the crown the same way again. Before there was Prince Harry, before the royal wedding, before the designer gowns and global attention, there was a man named Trevor Engelson. And if you asked the few who knew Meghan Markle during the early chapters of her life, before the palace gates and the paparazzi, they'll tell you Trevor was more than just her first husband. He was her mirror, her anchor, her co-conspirator in the Hollywood climb. He was also the one who knew her most closely, during the years when fame was just a dream and motherhood was a struggle too painful to say out loud. Trevor Engelson is not a household name, but he was far from unknown. A film producer by trade, he built his career in the often thankless, shadowy side of Hollywood, behind the camera. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't chasing red carpets. He had grit, patience, and the kind of connections you earn, not inherit. He worked his way up in the chaotic, cynical world of independent filmmaking, eventually founding his own production company, Underground. By the time he met Meghan Markle in the early 2000s, Trevor had already made a name for himself in the business side of entertainment, managing clients, developing scripts, producing mid-budget features. They met in Los Angeles, of course. Where else? It was one of those slow-burn romances. Meghan was in the early stages of her acting career, taking on small roles, brief appearances in soap operas, auditions for commercials, minor speaking lines in film and television. She was determined, elegant, sharp. Trevor was charmed by her, and according to people close to them at the time, the chemistry was natural. She wasn't yet the poised, royal-ready version of herself that the public would come to know. She was real, flawed, funny, ambitious in a way that burned through conversation. Friends described them as comfortable with one another. Trevor brought a kind of grounding to Meghan's otherwise turbulent ambition. She brought lightness, sophistication, and drive to his world of late-night edits and investor phone calls. They understood each other's hunger for success, even if their industries put them on opposite sides of the camera. For a time, they were that rare couple who didn't need the spotlight to feel seen. They dated for several years, supporting each other through near misses and career breakthroughs. Meghan's role on Suits would be the turning point, an opportunity that took her to Toronto for filming and gave her the steady platform she had long sought. But before that, in 2011, the couple got married in a low-profile but picturesque ceremony in Jamaica. It was intimate, casual. Just over 100 guests. No headlines. No tiaras. No million-dollar photo shoots. There's something haunting in that simplicity now. Looking back, the wedding appears almost like a moment from a parallel universe, one in which Meghan Markle remained in the Hollywood scene, pursued acting, and perhaps raised a family in Los Angeles with Trevor. But it wasn't meant to last. The marriage began to strain not long after her career started to take off. Distance played a role. She was often in Toronto filming. Trevor remained in LA juggling projects and meetings. There were whispers of imbalance, emotional and logistical. Meghan was changing. She had new circles, new aspirations, and reportedly, a growing fixation on image curation. According to one anonymous friend from her Suits days, Meghan had become almost obsessed with how she was perceived, not just by the public, but by those she hoped to join among Hollywood elites and influential circles. And Trevor? He was beginning to feel like a relic of her past, a chapter she no longer wanted to reread. There are no public outbursts, no scandals. Their marriage ended with a whisper, not a bang. In 2013, Meghan sent Trevor her wedding ring back by FedEx. No personal delivery, no final conversation, just a package, cold, efficient, and final. The act shocked even those who had seen the marriage unravel in real time. It was calculated, it was clean, and it marked the start of a pattern Meghan would later be accused of, closing doors behind her without looking back. For years after, Trevor remained silent. He dated, he worked, he stayed away from the press. In 2019, he remarried, this time to Tracy Corland, the daughter of a multi-millionaire banker. Their wedding was quiet, elegant, and devoid of the kind of royal theater that Meghan's second wedding embraced. Trevor seemed content to have moved on. But in private, those closest to him knew there was something unresolved. Not bitterness, not regret, but a weight, a knowing, something he carried alone, something connected to Meghan's silence, and the children the world assumed she had birthed herself. It wasn't just that Trevor had once been her husband. It was that he had been the only witness to the version of Meghan the world never saw. He had stood by her during her private struggles with fertility. He had listened to her heartbreak, held her as she cried in bathroom stalls after another failed test, sat through fertility consultations that ended with more questions than answers. It wasn't an easy time. The pressure of career and age, the unspoken expectations of womanhood, the whispered conversations about egg quality, hormone levels, and timelines. And then came the pivot. When medical hope began to fade, Meghan did what Meghan always did. She began to look for solutions. Clinical, strategic. She started researching surrogacy. She even brought it up in conversations with friends and colleagues, cloaked in hypotheticals. If I couldn't carry a child, would it still feel like mine? She once asked a casting agent over lunch. It wasn't a random question. It was a seed. Trevor remembered when she first brought it up to him, nervous, but excited. She had already found contacts. Agencies in Los Angeles that specialized in confidential surrogacy arrangements for high-profile individuals. She talked about it like a business deal. Efficient, controlled, protected. No media, no records, no risk. At first, Trevor was supportive. He wanted a family too. And if surrogacy was the only way, they'd figure it out together. But something about the way Meghan approached it unsettled him. It was less about building a family and more about protecting an image. She was fixated on controlling the narrative, right down to the optics of a pregnancy. If they went through with surrogacy, Meghan didn't want anyone, absolutely anyone, to know. Not even her parents. Not even her future employers. Especially not the press. She wanted to perform the pregnancy, as Trevor once described it privately. To wear the belly. To pose for photos. To write the script of her motherhood. He thought it was dramatic at the time, maybe even a fantasy, but she was dead serious. That was when the contract was drafted. Through a high-end law firm that had worked with A-list celebrities and Silicon Valley billionaires, Meghan arranged for a legal agreement that outlined every detail of a surrogacy arrangement. Egg donor selection, compensation packages, post-birth custody, behavioral clauses for the surrogate, everything was in writing. Trevor helped review it. At the time, he believed they were planning a family, that this was simply a private route toward a shared future. He never imagined it would become a buried weapon in a global royal scandal. The contract was never executed, at least not during their marriage. They never followed through. The divorce came too quickly, the relationship too fractured. But the document remained. Trevor kept a copy, locked away, not because he planned to use it, but because it was a piece of his truth. A piece of her truth. Years later, when Meghan appeared with Prince Harry, glowing and supposedly pregnant, Trevor felt the air leave the room. He watched interviews with forced smiles. He read royal press statements crafted with precision. He noticed what wasn't said, what was avoided, what sounded too scripted to be real. He recognized the performance. And deep inside, a quiet question began to build. Had she followed through? Had she finally used that surrogacy route? Only this time, with more power, more money, and far more to lose if discovered? This chapter, his chapter, isn't just about a failed marriage. It's about a man who watched a woman he once loved reinvent herself at every turn. Who watched her bury her pain, hide her past, and build a life on the ashes of something deeply, intimately real. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want fame. He didn't want anything, really, until he realized that the truth he carried might be the only truth the world had left. And so, as we move forward into the chapters that expose the cracks in Meghan's pregnancies, the silence of the palace, and the whispers that refuse to die, we begin with him. With Trevor Engelson, the man before the prince, the ghost in Meghan's carefully curated story, and the one person with nothing left to lose and everything to reveal. For many women, the path to motherhood is deeply personal, often filled with joy, anticipation, and a touch of fear. But for Meghan Markle, that journey, if it existed at all in the traditional sense, was something far more complicated, hidden, and heavily guarded. Long before the world knew her as a duchess, as the polished royal wife and doting mother of two, Meghan was navigating a quieter, more painful battle, a struggle with fertility that few knew about, and even fewer were allowed to speak of. Those who were around Meghan in the early 2010s, back when she was still working her way up the Hollywood ladder, recall a woman who was not only career-driven, but also increasingly fixated on timelines. Not just for auditions, contracts, or pilot seasons, but personal ones, biological ones. Friends described conversations that would begin lightheartedly over brunch, only to end with Meghan quietly reflecting on age, expectations, and her fears about not being able to have children naturally. At the time, Meghan was already in her 30s, and although she looked radiant and youthful, she was acutely aware of the biological clock ticking in the background of her ambitions. She'd spoken, in passing, about wanting to be a mother. But unlike some, she didn't paint it as a fantasy. She didn't dream aloud about baby names or nursery colors. Instead, her tone was often clinical, pragmatic. She approached motherhood with the same calculated intensity she applied to her career. Those close to her say it wasn't until after her marriage to Trevor Engelson that the concerns deepened into something more tangible. During their first year as husband and wife, Meghan reportedly began exploring fertility options with quiet urgency. She booked private appointments with specialists in Beverly Hills. She visited wellness clinics that offered alternative therapies, acupuncture, nutritional evaluations, Eastern fertility treatments. It was all part of a carefully constructed plan, one she never openly discussed with even her closest confidants. By all accounts, the first major red flag came during a visit to a highly exclusive fertility clinic off Sunset Boulevard. According to a former nurse who has since spoken on condition of anonymity, Meghan underwent a full hormone panel and ovarian reserve test. The results, while not conclusive, indicated low egg quality and an accelerated fertility decline for her age. The nurse recalled Meghan's composure. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She simply took the results, nodded slowly, and scheduled follow-ups. She was, as the nurse described, more focused on next steps than feelings. Those next steps involved consultations with IVF specialists. Meghan, at the time, reportedly began hormone therapy to stimulate egg production. This process is grueling for many women. It involves daily injections, mood swings, physical discomfort, and a level of emotional vulnerability that's hard to explain. Yet Meghan seemed determined to master it. She kept spreadsheets. She tracked hormone levels. She avoided alcohol, adjusted her diet, and timed everything with mechanical precision. Trevor was supportive during this phase. He attended some of the appointments. He rearranged meetings to be there for blood draws and ultrasounds. But even he, according to a friend of his, began to feel like he was being managed rather than partnered. Meghan's approach to fertility, while admirable in its discipline, was often devoid of emotional openness. It was as though she saw the entire process as another performance to perfect. Eventually, the treatments led to a round of egg retrieval. Insiders say it was moderately successful, but not groundbreaking. A handful of viable eggs, one or two possibly fertilized. There was hope, but it was fragile. At least one early attempt at embryo transfer reportedly failed, though this has never been officially confirmed. What is known is that by the end of their second year of marriage, Meghan had shifted her focus. She stopped talking about conception and began talking about alternatives. Quietly, she started researching surrogacy. To those on the outside, this may seem sudden, but for Meghan, it was simply a pivot, a strategic redirection toward the same goal, motherhood. She had read extensively about celebrity surrogacy. Nicole Kidman, Sarah Jessica Parker, Kim Kardashian. She admired the discretion, the control, the ability to manage the entire process without ever exposing oneself to public vulnerability. And for someone like Meghan, who had always struggled with relinquishing control, this appealed deeply. The surrogacy exploration began discreetly. Meghan reached out to legal contacts she had made through Trevor's industry network. She inquired about contracts, confidentiality clauses, and agency protocols. Everything was kept off the books. No emails, no texts, only handwritten notes and in-person meetings at upscale lounges and private residences. Trevor, for his part, was initially hesitant. Surrogacy wasn't something he had considered at this stage. He wanted children, yes, but he still held hope that natural conception was possible. Meghan, however, was already mentally ahead. She wasn't interested in waiting anymore. Her career was gaining traction, and she wanted to time motherhood to align, not conflict, with her ambitions. This friction over surrogacy would become one of the many quiet tensions that fractured their marriage. Meghan, ever the planner, wanted to move forward, fast. She even brought up the idea of a future pregnancy performance, joking at a dinner party that no one can really tell the difference if you wear the right dress. Her tone was flippant, but her eyes, as one guest recalled, were calculating. It was more than a joke. Behind closed doors, Meghan reportedly began constructing a vision for how she might present a future child as her own, if carried by another. She studied bump prosthetics used in film. She examined celebrity baby bump timelines. She noticed how often media outlets simply echoed what publicists told them. In Meghan's mind, if the optics were right, the truth could remain hidden forever. It's worth noting that not everyone in Meghan's circle was comfortable with this line of thinking. A longtime friend from Northwestern University, who has since distanced herself from Meghan, later confided to a colleague that Meghan had once asked her if she thought the world would respect a mother who didn't carry her own child. The question wasn't hypothetical. It was a window into the shame and stigma Meghan was already anticipating. Because for all her bravado, Meghan was still battling something deeply human: fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being exposed, fear of not being seen as a real mother. And perhaps, most powerfully, fear of being unworthy in the eyes of the institutions she so desperately wanted to enter: Hollywood, the royal family, and public consciousness. This fear shaped every decision she made from that point forward. It's why, when her marriage to Trevor began to unravel, she kept quiet about the fertility treatments. It's why, after the divorce, she refused to acknowledge any of the emotional wreckage left behind. And it's why, when she finally met Prince Harry, she never spoke a word of her past struggles. Instead, she allowed a new narrative to form, one of natural pregnancies, glowing motherhood, an effortless maternal instinct. The world saw her cradle her belly in designer gowns, saw her place protective hands over her womb during interviews. They believed it. They wanted to believe it. Because the image was perfect. But behind that image was pain. Not just the physical pain of fertility failure, but the emotional erosion of a woman who had convinced herself that motherhood was only valid if it looked a certain way. Meghan had the resources, the connections, the legal shields. And so she buried the truth, wrapped it in the language of privacy, and began the most elaborate performance of her life. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the possibility of deception. It's the reality of how common this pain is. Thousands of women struggle silently with infertility every day. They feel shame, confusion, isolation. And while many seek support, Meghan sought secrecy. She didn't want empathy. She wanted control. And that, perhaps, is what separates her journey from so many others. Not the fact that she may have used a surrogate. Not the idea of crafting a family through alternative means. But the deliberate effort to hide it. To erase it. To pretend it never existed. As we move into the next chapter, one that details how Meghan allegedly created and secured a surrogacy contract with legal protections so airtight that even palace aides were kept in the dark, we begin to see the full shape of her plan. It wasn't just about having children. It was about building a legacy that looked perfect on paper, but may have been founded on a carefully constructed lie. It wasn't just a fallback plan. It wasn't a quiet act of desperation. It was a business decision, calculated, deliberate, and drawn up with the kind of legal precision one might expect from a woman who had spent years navigating Hollywood's minefields. When Meghan Markle allegedly decided to pursue surrogacy, she didn't simply turn to an agency and wait for a miracle. She drafted a contract. A real one. Not hypothetical. Not tentative. But a binding legal document designed to protect her image, her future, and above all, her secret. The world of celebrity surrogacy is far more structured than most people realize. In Los Angeles, where fame and privacy collide in chaotic harmony, an entire industry exists to serve high-profile individuals looking to become parents through unconventional means. These arrangements don't begin in doctors' offices. They begin in law firms, at polished conference tables, with confidentiality clauses signed before a single embryo is even created. Meghan knew this world well. Through Trevor Engelson's network of producers, publicists, and attorneys, she had access to a short list of legal professionals who had handled everything from paternity disputes for A-list actors to non-disclosure agreements for illicit affairs. These weren't family lawyers. These were reputation managers, legal minds trained to insulate their clients from scandal, litigation, and press exposure. According to a former assistant at one such firm, whose employment dates matched the period during which Meghan and Trevor were married, a unique file was opened under a pseudonym. The assistant didn't know it was Meghan at first. The name on the paperwork was a variation, one she recognized only later after spotting handwriting on internal notes that matched samples from Meghan's public documents. The file included draft contracts, surrogate profiles, and egg donor consent forms. The language was cold, clinical, and absolute. These contracts weren't just about outlining medical expectations. They were about optics. One clause, according to the source, specifically prohibited the surrogate from appearing in public during the pregnancy. Another restricted the surrogate from disclosing any emotional connection to the child. The most chilling clause of all, a stipulation that in the event of public exposure, the intended mother, Meghan, could legally claim sole maternal status, regardless of biological contribution. It was clear from the outset, this wasn't just about becoming a mother. It was about appearing to be one. At all costs. The legal architecture of the contract was impressively robust. It began with pre-surrogacy assessments, mandatory psychological evaluations for the surrogate, detailed medical disclosures, and financial negotiations that dwarfed standard industry rates. Meghan wanted someone perfect, according to notes left by a legal associate. She specified appearance traits, health history, and even social behavior. She didn't want someone who might get emotionally attached. She didn't want someone with a chaotic lifestyle or any history of substance use. She wanted control, and the contract reflected that need in every line. There was also a public narrative clause, rare even in celebrity surrogacy. This section outlined how public statements would be handled should the surrogate's existence ever come to light. It included pre-written statements, social media instructions, and a list of publicists who were to be contacted immediately if any leak occurred. Meghan, it seemed, was preparing not only to hide the surrogacy, but to erase it from possibility altogether. Trevor Engelson's name appeared on several early drafts of the contract. At the time, they were still married, and he was expected to be the legal father. He signed off on certain revisions, raised concerns about the emotional consequences, and questioned the necessity of some of the more extreme clauses. Meghan, reportedly, dismissed his concerns. She argued that in Hollywood, appearances were everything, and that the public would never understand a woman choosing not to carry her own child, even if it were medically necessary. What struck Trevor most was not the idea of surrogacy itself, but the lengths to which Meghan was willing to go to protect the illusion of pregnancy. She spoke openly about ordering pregnancy prosthetics if necessary, about scheduling appearances with deliberately padded silhouettes. She even discussed coordinating the timeline of her bump reveal with a major media appearance, in case she ever found herself in the public eye during the process. This wasn't just planning. It was stage direction. By the end of the drafting process, Meghan had a document that read more like a script than a legal agreement. Scene 1, Conception. Scene 2, Curated pregnancy updates. Scene 3, Delivery announcement, complete with staged photos and official hospital correspondence, whether or not she ever stepped foot in the maternity ward. It was all part of a long-term strategy, one that, in retrospect, reads more like a production manual than a parenting plan. Sources close to the legal team claim that while the contract was never activated during her marriage to Trevor, it was preserved. Meghan paid a retainer to keep it on file. Some believe that once she entered the royal sphere, she revisited this same contract, either adapting it for a new surrogate or using its blueprint to draft a version under the Crown's legal jurisdiction. Others insist it was never used at all. But the question that lingers is not whether it was activated, but why it was created in the first place. If Meghan had no intention of hiding a surrogacy, why build a fortress around the idea? This chapter in her story, hidden away in filing cabinets and bound by non-disclosure agreements, paints a stark picture. It tells us that Meghan was not only thinking about motherhood in mechanical terms, but was actively planning to manufacture an experience. Not because she didn't want to be a mother, but because she didn't want to appear different. Not in an industry where image is survival. Not in a monarchy where optics are everything. Years later, as she stood alongside Prince Harry and held her bump on camera with theatrical precision, one has to wonder, was this performance years in the making? The contract also touched on post-birth expectations. There were clauses detailing how the child's birth certificate would be issued. One section outlined how the surrogate would waive any rights to communication or interaction beyond the delivery. Another outlined a financial penalty if any post-birth photos of the surrogate were leaked. The intention was clear: eliminate any physical or legal trace of the surrogate's involvement. This level of control is not entirely unusual among high-profile clients. But the emotional detachment in Meghan's alleged approach was startling. Even the legal teams involved reportedly expressed concern over her intensity. She wasn't just trying to protect her privacy. She was trying to rewrite reality. And yet, to those who knew her well, this wasn't surprising. Meghan had always approached life like a role to be played. She adapted to her surroundings, polished her accent, reshaped her friendships based on context. From her early school days, where she oscillated between relatable classmate and teacher's pet, to her Hollywood years, where she mastered networking like a political candidate, Meghan was always molding her identity to fit the room. Motherhood, in her eyes, wasn't just a biological milestone. It was a necessary evolution in her personal brand. And if biology stood in the way, she would find a workaround. Quietly, legally, completely. When the final crack appeared in Meghan Markle's first marriage, it didn't erupt with tears or public scandal. There were no lengthy court battles, no media outbursts, no teary confessions on talk shows. Instead, it arrived in a padded envelope. A wedding ring slipped into a FedEx package and shipped across the country. Trevor Engelson opened the parcel in stunned silence, the final word in a marriage that had slowly unraveled behind closed doors. No note, no explanation, Just a symbolic gesture from a woman who had already moved on, not just emotionally, but strategically. The silence surrounding Meghan and Trevor's divorce remains one of the most curious absences in her carefully managed public image. While her rise to royal status has been documented in painstaking detail, from her romance with Prince Harry to her battles with the British press, the years immediately preceding that ascent are shrouded in fog. Particularly the events surrounding her split with the man who had stood beside her through fertility treatments, career setbacks, and the earliest whispers of surrogacy planning. But divorce, for Meghan, wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the beginning of a complete erasure. A deliberate, almost surgical effort to eliminate any record, connection, or association that might tether her to the past she no longer needed. And among the things she appeared most determined to bury was the truth about her infertility and the legal framework she had built to conceal it. Sources close to Trevor say he was blindsided by the abrupt ending. Though their marriage had grown tense and emotionally distant, he had assumed, naively, that the problems were still being worked through. Meghan, on the other hand, had already left emotionally. Her move to Toronto for Suits had given her independence, a new social circle, and a fresh start. By the time she mailed that ring, she had already severed most of the connections that once bound her to Los Angeles and to Trevor. But what followed wasn't just a clean break. It was a purge. Digital records from Meghan's early Hollywood years began to disappear. Social media posts were deleted. Blog entries from her now-defunct lifestyle site, The TIG, were systematically scrubbed of any references to her marriage, her medical journey, or even emotional reflections that might hint at past struggles. Public relations teams were enlisted to revise her narrative. Old headshots were replaced. Wikipedia entries were updated. Paparazzi photos from her Trevor years were bought and buried. Even more chilling were the whispers that Meghan had reached out to clinics and legal offices she had once visited, requesting files be closed, transferred, or, in some cases, destroyed. One anonymous administrator at a Los Angeles fertility clinic confirmed that Meghan's name had been on a list of high-profile privacy clients, whose files were treated with extraordinary discretion. When the divorce went through, someone from her legal team allegedly contacted the clinic and requested that all communication be redirected through a third-party handler. No forwarding address. No direct contact. Just silence. Meanwhile, the legal firm that had helped draft the surrogacy contract with Trevor also went quiet. According to a former paralegal who left the firm shortly after the divorce, Meghan's file, originally under a pseudonym, was moved to a vaulted classification. Access was restricted to only the lead partner and a single assigned associate. When the paralegal inquired about the unusual protocol, she was told bluntly, "The client's future depends on that file never seeing daylight." Trevor, for his part, never publicly contested the divorce. He didn't leak emails or speak to tabloids. In fact, he seemed to vanish almost as thoroughly as Meghan wished he would. Friends say he was devastated, not just by the emotional betrayal, but by how thoroughly he had been erased. It was as if the years they spent together, the laughs, the late nights, the private pain, had been deleted with the stroke of a pen. But Trevor wasn't naive. He knew what Meghan was doing. And he understood the stakes. Her career was accelerating. Her contacts were expanding. She had begun associating with more politically minded circles, networking with people who saw her not just as an actress, but as a brand, a future power figure. And motherhood, the idea of being seen as nurturing, feminine, and grounded, was becoming a key component of that brand. A clean break from Trevor was essential. But even more essential was the elimination of any evidence that might contradict the narrative she was preparing to construct. A narrative in which she would one day become a royal mother. A woman who had it all. A woman who had never struggled. A woman who had birthed two perfect children naturally and effortlessly, as the world expected of princesses. That narrative couldn't coexist with the truth. And so the deleted trails began. A friend of Trevor's recalled a moment shortly after the divorce, when Trevor had gone back to retrieve some of his things from a storage unit they once shared. To his shock, several boxes were missing, including one that had contained old documents from their fertility journey, medical receipts, appointment summaries, insurance correspondence. Gone. When he reached out to Meghan's team, he received a curt response. All personal materials have been disposed of as part of the separation agreement. He hadn't agreed to that. He hadn't even seen the fine print. But it was done. Meghan had taken control of the past, just as thoroughly as she planned to control the future. The digital cleanup was equally thorough. Online forums that once discussed her early years were contacted with takedown notices. Fan pages that had posted pictures of her and Trevor were mysteriously shut down. Entertainment blogs that mentioned her previous marriage received cease and desist emails, often from unnamed legal firms. It wasn't just reputation management. It was a digital exorcism. And all of it was a precursor to something bigger. Meghan wasn't simply trying to remove Trevor from the public's memory. She was preparing to rewrite her identity from the ground up. She knew, even then, that her next chapter would require a new script. One that didn't include medical struggle, fertility treatments, or the legal complexities of surrogacy contracts. One that would allow her to step into the world of royalty with a clean slate and a carefully edited origin story. But while Meghan was wiping away the past, Trevor was left holding the pieces. The memories, the pain, and yes, the contract. He never destroyed it. He thought about it. He even considered burning it once, during a particularly dark period after the divorce. But something stopped him. Not malice, not revenge, just the quiet, gnawing sense that the truth mattered. That someday, someone would need to remember what really happened. He stored the contract in a fireproof safe in his office. And for years, he didn't look at it. He moved on, rebuilt his life, married again. But as Meghan's star rose, as the headlines began to call her the People's Duchess, as the pregnancy photos began to flood the internet, as she held her baby bump on camera and declared her joy to Oprah, something inside him began to stir. Not anger, not bitterness, just disbelief. Disbelief that the world had been so thoroughly convinced by a performance he knew had been rehearsed years in advance. He watched as Meghan and Harry announced Archie's birth with carefully worded press releases. He noticed the absence of hospital photos, the lack of clear delivery details, the strangely vague statements about medical teams. He watched again when Lilibet's birth was announced under similar circumstances. No witnesses, no documentation, no first-hand accounts. He knew that script. He'd helped write it. And so, while Meghan's team continued scrubbing away the past, Trevor held on to his last piece of it. Not for profit, not to harm, but because he understood something Meghan had tried to forget. The truth doesn't disappear just because you stop talking about it. The moment Meghan Markle met Prince Harry, everything changed, not just for her personal life, but for her entire public identity. What had once been a struggling Hollywood actress with a trail of failed auditions, a failed marriage, and hidden personal struggles was about to become one of the most scrutinized and admired women in the world. But what the world didn't know was that Meghan's transformation didn't start with that first date in London. It had started long before, in Los Angeles boardrooms, behind clinic doors, and in the corridors of her own ambition. Her divorce from Trevor Engelson had left a clean break, but it also left a vacuum, one Meghan was eager to fill with a new image. Not the one Hollywood had boxed her into. The ethnically ambiguous sidekick, the pretty but forgettable love interest. She was ready to re-emerge as something much bigger. A global figure. A voice. A woman of depth, elegance, and purpose. That reinvention began in subtle ways. Meghan moved her base to Toronto, where Suits was filmed. The move gave her physical and emotional distance from the LA scene that had defined her past, and from Trevor. She surrounded herself with new friends, began working with stylists, photographers, and PR advisors who specialized in reputation design. Gone were the party photos, the tabloid sightings, and the casual red carpet looks. In their place emerged a softer, more polished version of Meghan, one who appeared in carefully curated Instagram posts and posed for magazine features that emphasized her charity work, her biracial heritage, her intellect. During this period, Meghan also took calculated steps to align herself with progressive causes. She spoke about gender equality, diversity in media, and mental health awareness. She began giving interviews that hinted at personal struggles without ever naming them. When asked about motherhood, she spoke abstractly. She emphasized the importance of being nurturing and purposeful, but never shared specific dreams about children or plans to start a family. She left that space ambiguous, open to future revision. Meanwhile, the press began to take notice. Meghan was no longer just Rachel from Suits. She was being called a woman to watch, a rising feminist voice, and Hollywood's next humanitarian. The groundwork was being laid, and Meghan, ever the strategist, knew how to keep the momentum building. Then came London. Through a mutual friend, Meghan was introduced to Prince Harry, the heir to the British throne, the wild child turned humanitarian who had spent years trying to redefine himself outside the shadow of his royal lineage. Their first meeting, according to both their accounts, was informal. But those who were present suggest that Meghan was far more prepared than she let on. She had researched Harry. She knew his causes, his friends, his pain points. She came to that dinner not as a starstruck outsider, but as someone who believed she belonged in that world. Harry was charmed. Meghan was radiant, witty, poised. She didn't fawn. She listened. She asked questions. She shared just enough about herself to seem grounded, but left out everything that might have complicated her story, including her past fertility struggles, her surrogacy plans, and the existence of the contract she had once drawn up with Trevor. From the very beginning, Meghan positioned herself as someone emotionally aligned with Harry's values. She played up their shared interest in philanthropy, their mutual distrust of the press, and their deep wounds related to family trauma. But while Harry approached the relationship with cautious optimism, Meghan approached it with precision. Within months, the couple was inseparable. Their romance was intense and private. Meghan began closing down the last remnants of her public-facing identity. The TIG was shuttered. Her social media accounts went dark. Public appearances slowed. She began spending more time in London and less in North America. Behind the scenes, she was preparing for something much bigger than a cross-continental romance. She was preparing for royalty. The engagement came quickly, but it wasn't just a love story. It was a transition. Meghan stepped into her new role with the careful deliberation of someone walking onto a global stage. Her wardrobe changed. Her tone changed. Her interviews became rehearsed and sparse. She learned protocol, mastered palace etiquette, and adopted the language of royalty, speaking in passive tones, deflecting direct questions, and emphasizing duty over emotion. But one thing she didn't do was address the question that loomed over every royal bride: motherhood. While Kate Middleton had been scrutinized from the moment she married Prince William for signs of pregnancy, Meghan was allowed, at least temporarily, to escape that pressure. The media was too busy dissecting her race, her background, her relationship with her father. But inside the palace, the question of children was unavoidable. Royal succession depended on it. There were rumors, of course, that Meghan underwent private medical consultations shortly after her engagement. No one in the royal circle would speak on the record, but palace aides noticed frequent, unexplained visits to specialists. Meghan maintained strict dietary and fitness routines, and reportedly had meetings with high-end maternity consultants in secret. But unlike most women preparing for pregnancy, Meghan seemed less focused on biology and more on logistics. A palace insider described her as interested in the presentation of motherhood, not the experience of it. She requested information about how past royal pregnancies had been handled in the press. She studied how Diana had navigated paparazzi while pregnant. She asked about photo protocols at royal hospitals, how birth announcements were worded, and how much access the public was typically given to newborns. She didn't ask about doulas, or delivery techniques, or the medical teams that had been used by Kate. Her focus, as always, was on image. Meanwhile, Harry, deeply in love and eager to start a family, seemed unaware of the deeper truths Meghan had hidden. He spoke publicly about wanting children. He beamed at Meghan during walkabouts, placed his hand on her back when reporters asked about parenthood. And Meghan, ever composed, smiled and answered in generalities. "We're taking things one step at a time. We're excited for the future. We'll see what happens." In private, however, preparations were already underway. Shortly before their wedding, Meghan was seen meeting with a Los Angeles-based legal consultant who had ties to high-level surrogacy agencies. The meeting was said to be brief, conducted in a hotel suite under a pseudonym. It was unclear whether the meeting was to revisit the original contract drafted with Trevor or to create a new one, tailored for a royal context. What is known is that shortly after, a separate team of legal advisors began working on a set of private documents that would later be housed not in Los Angeles, but in a secured legal firm in the UK. Those documents, according to a whistleblower with knowledge of the firm's records, included references to non-disclosure agreements, prearranged medical statements, and financial transactions routed through anonymous trusts. They were designed to insulate all parties, Meghan, the surrogate, the palace, from public discovery. In other words, the royal machine had adopted Meghan's plan. The timing was critical. Meghan and Harry's wedding was just months away. The couple needed to appear unified, healthy, and full of potential. Any hint that Meghan might be struggling with fertility or that surrogacy was being considered would have derailed the narrative entirely. And so, the preparations continued in the shadows. Publicly, Meghan embraced her new role with calculated charm. She wore demure gowns, smiled for the cameras, and spoke in polished phrases that hinted at a life of service. She visited schools, attended charity events, and gave speeches about female empowerment. The press fell in love. So did much of the world. Here was a modern duchess, biracial, independent, glamorous, yet grounded. A fresh face for a tired monarchy. And yet, the silence around her maternal plans was deafening. For a woman whose life had been so public, so widely dissected, the absence of credible information about her fertility or pregnancy intentions was odd. No interviews, no statements, no friendly leaks to the press. Nothing. Until, of course, the pregnancy announcement came. When the palace announced that Meghan was expecting her first child, it was met with global celebration. The headlines were glowing. Photos of her radiant smile and hand-placed bump were splashed across newspapers worldwide. But behind the scenes, a few noticed inconsistencies. There were questions about the timing, about her physical appearance, about the lack of medical confirmations, and about the fact that Meghan and Harry refused to reveal which hospital they planned to use, or even whether they would allow press access on the day of delivery. It wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented, and those questions would only multiply in the months to come. From the moment Meghan Markle announced her first pregnancy with Prince Harry, the world watched in wonder. News outlets celebrated the dawn of a new royal era. Tabloids declared the baby's impending arrival a symbol of hope, and social media erupted in waves of blue hearts and congratulatory emojis. But behind the public fanfare lay a series of anomalies so consistent, so meticulously orchestrated, that they began to resemble the patterns of a performance rather than the messy unpredictability of real life. To understand why this pregnancy felt too perfect, we must first consider the norms of royal gestation. When Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was expecting each of her children, the British press documented every milestone. First official announcement, confirmation from her medical team, details of her hospital arrangements, glimpses of her maternity wardrobe, accounts from palace aides about morning sickness, and well-timed patronage visits that subtly revealed her growing bump. Photographers stationed themselves outside the Lindo wing. Books were written about her due dates. Biographers tracked her movements. And yet, when reading about Meghan's pregnancy, one encounters a conspicuous absence of these traditional details. The initial announcement came via a brief palace statement. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex are delighted to announce that the Duchess is expecting their first child in the spring of 2019. No further information was offered. No scans were shared. No press conferences. Just the bare bones. Was this unusual? Yes, and it was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Meghan and Harry made a handful of public appearances. Many focused on diplomatic visits, charity work, and engagements with children's organizations. In each of these, Meghan's attire was chosen with surgical precision. Flowing gowns that draped exactly at her waist, strategically placed hands to conceal any uneven curves, and photographic angles that minimized bulges. Professional stylists coordinated her looks to appear loose enough to hint at pregnancy, yet never so fitted that the bump's shape became clear. The world saw a mystery bump, an invitation to marvel without revealing too much. Yet interest only grew. Was Meghan experiencing morning sickness? The palace declined to comment. Was she working with a specific obstetrician? Sources responded only with the assertion that the Duchess is in excellent health and is receiving exceptional care. No names. No institutions. Just a broad assurance. One royal correspondent described the situation as an exercise in enigma. Meanwhile, paparazzi photos began to circulate, some taken from great distances, others tightly cropped. In a rare candid shot, Meghan stood beside Harry on a balcony, her hand resting at what looked like mid-imprint. In another blurry image, she descended the stairs at an official engagement, her posture eerily straight, as if trained to avoid any jostle. To conspiracy theorists, these photos were fuel. They saw bump inconsistencies, one moment perfectly round, the next almost flat. Why such variability? They wondered. Why so much secrecy? Those close to palace protocol tried to rationalize the oddities. They claimed Meghan was protecting her privacy, that she had the right to control her own story, and that the palace would reveal details when she was ready. But for traditionalists, this departure from convention sounded alarm bells. The royal family had always presented pregnancies as a moment of national celebration. The public had become accustomed to the ritual, the announcement, the scan, the procession, the birth. Any deviation from that template seemed calculated. And calculated it was. In private, members of Meghan's inner circle observed how she met weekly with a hand-picked group, stylists, publicists, photographers, and legal advisors. They rehearsed every appearance. They timed when to release official images and controlled which outlets could use them. Detailed memos outlined which angles were permissible, which words to use in captions, which wardrobe choices best concealed any irregularities. It resembled a movie production more than a royal baby reveal. Then came the Oprah interview, taped after the birth but aired later. In it, Meghan spoke tenderly of her pregnancy experience, her joy at feeling kicks, her connection to the baby, her awe at the changes in her body. She described memories of late-night cravings and whispered conversations with Harry about names and nursery designs. It was intimate storytelling, designed to humanize her, to draw empathy, to answer doubters. Yet scholars of rhetoric noticed something peculiar. These recollections were all post hoc. There were no contemporaneous accounts, no diary entries, no earlier interviews that mentioned the same details. It suggested that the narrative had been constructed after the fact. Meanwhile, journalists digging for independent verification found nothing. No medical sources could confirm the timeline. No hospital listed Meghan as a patient. No photographs of an actual maternity ward ever surfaced. People who claimed to have assisted with her care remained anonymous, citing strict confidentiality agreements. The more the press probed, the fewer facts emerged. Around this time, one or two minor outlets published speculative pieces suggesting Meghan might have used a surrogate. These articles were met with immediate legal threats from palace lawyers. Notices went out demanding retractions, references be removed, and domain registrars block content. The swift, aggressive responses fueled suspicions. If the palace's position were defensible, that Meghan was pregnant and would give birth in the usual way, why such fierce protection against mere speculation? As the predicted due date approached, the world braced for the moment Meghan would present her newborn. Expectations were set, a formal statement announcing labor, then the line of royals waiting outside the hospital doors, then the baby being shown to the cameras. But the announcement of Archie's birth came differently. A brief note in the evening, read from an official palace spokesperson. Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex was safely delivered of a son early this morning. No location was given, no hospital mentioned, no invitations to the world's media, just the fact of a safe delivery. And then, for the first time, we saw a photo of mother and baby, an image that appeared heavily retouched, taken in soft focus, as if designed to prevent any clear examination of birthmarks, lines, or baby features that might betray the child's parentage. It was a tender moment, but also meticulously staged. A bench by a window, natural light, mother gazing lovingly down, baby wrapped in white cloth. The perfect tableau. It all looked so effortless, so unblemished, so perfect. To those who'd studied Meghan's earlier surrogacy contract drafts, the entire sequence read like an enactment of clauses written years before. The curated images matched the legal requirement that birth announcements be accompanied by official photographs taken in controlled environments. The non-disclosure threats to hospital staff echoed the legal stipulation that any professional associated with the birth remain silent. The lack of medical transparency fulfilled the contract's objective to obscure clinical details. But what about the emotional reality? In dozens of interviews, including one given to a now-defunct celebrity magazine, Meghan described feeling overwhelmed by love, tears streaming as she cradled her newborn, and a rush of hormones that changed everything. She spoke of looking into Archie's eyes and feeling an immediate connection. Yet this emotional narrative clashed with other reports that said Meghan retreated from public life for months, declined to visit friends, and maintained a rigid schedule of palace duties even while supposedly recovering from childbirth. Some insiders suggested she was restless, eager to return to work, and unwilling to dwell on maternity leave. The diary of a former royal staffer, published unofficially on a private blog, painted an even stranger picture. Meghan allegedly held strategy meetings within days of Archie's birth, planning guest lists for future events, negotiating deals with television producers, and selecting designers for her baby's christening gown. The staffer described Meghan as a woman on a mission, not a mother on leave. If true, it suggested that the baby's arrival served not as a moment of maternal bonding, but as a milestone in her broader career arc. In time, the chatter died down. Archie's widely circulated first portrait became irrevocably linked to the Sussex brand. A softer monarchy, modern and diverse, breaking with tradition to prioritize privacy. The palace congratulated itself on a successful innovation in royal protocol. And Meghan? She was lauded as a mother who navigated the complexities of celebrity and royalty with grace, never letting public expectations overshadow her personal boundaries. Yet beneath the applause, the questions lingered. If Meghan had carried Archie naturally, why were so many elements missing? If she had experienced the typical joys and challenges of pregnancy, why did she never reveal them in real time? Why did she insist on controlling the narrative so tightly that even camera crews filming the royal documentary were restricted from capturing hospital corridors or informal moments? The most telling detail came several years later, when Trevor Engelson's revelations began to surface. In an off-the-record conversation, later leaked, he confirmed that Meghan had drafted a surrogacy contract years before Archie was conceived. He said that contract included all the legal language needed to produce a child via surrogate while preserving the illusion of pregnancy. He recalled blood tests, hormone treatments that could mask a pregnant profile, and prosthetic bump fittings discussed in hushed voices. He described how he had watched Meghan assemble a team to plan every minute of the surrogacy performance. At that moment, everything clicked. The secrecy, the controlled appearances, the aggressive legal threats, the absence of verifiable medical details, the perfect maternity wardrobe, the post-birth photo shoot. It all resembled the enactment of a contract clause, the fulfillment of a carefully laid plan. And yet, to most of the world, it remained invisible, blended into the gleaming story of a duchess who had arrived at motherhood with style and poise.